What if everything you thought you knew about South Africa's disappearing white sharks is only part of the story? I'm betting that most of you who will have clicked on this video have your fingers firmly pointed towards killer whales, right? And you're not wrong. For years, this one explanation dominated the headlines, and it led us to believe that killer whales were the main reason these massive sharks pretty much vanished from South Africa. And yes, killer whales are involved here, that much is real. But according to new research, focusing on just them might have distracted us from something much bigger and far more sinister. Because long before the headlines and long before the viral videos, the data that we had available was already changing, quietly, steadily, and almost unnoticed. And when scientists looked closely, they discovered hidden patterns that didn't quite match up with the story that we've all been told, me included. So in this video today, we're going to be diving deep into the science behind South Africa's great white shark decline, the role of killer whales, the role of everything else, and the truth that was hiding in the data. Welcome back to another Shark Bites episode, everyone. So a few years back now, we temporarily closed the book on our South Africa white shark videos here on the channel. I'd made a few videos looking at the white sharks in this part of the world and their predator-prey relationship with killer whales. Although the information that you'll have learned from this video here is, as of 2026, now out of date. It's not necessarily wholly wrong, but as we'll learn today, all is not as it seems. Because not long after that video went live, some scientific debate started bubbling away under the surface, and I was just keeping an eye on it from afar. That debate raised questions about the scientific reasoning for these disappearing white sharks, and it all very recently came to a head. But to truly understand this mysterious story, we've got to go back all the way to 1991. On the 11th of April 1991, South Africa became the first country in the world to give full legal protection to white sharks, Carcharodon carcharias. This decision was a pioneering landmark move in marine conservation, with the country positioning themselves as a global conservation leader. South Africa basically recognized the ecological necessity of apex predators, even though the data that they had available to them was relatively limited. The decision they made set a global precedent based on a precautionary approach to managing ecosystems, i.e. preventing ecosystem collapse was an immediate necessity, even without full scientific certainty about what exactly was happening beneath the waves. And as the years went by, the evidence of that global precedent was clear. Several big countries followed suit in the mid-90s. Australia, New Zealand, and the US all began to put legislation in place that protected these animals. But the biggest impact that South Africa had was felt a little bit closer to home. A few years before, in the late 1980s, early sporadic cage diving cropped up in the Western Cape, specifically around Struis Bay and False Bay. But after South Africa protected the white shark, the cage diving industry grew exponentially, with commercial operators establishing themselves across South Africa. For decades, the country was considered one of the greatest places on earth to see great white sharks. False Bay, Gansbaai, Seal Island, Mossel Bay, tens of thousands of people flocked to these locations, all wanting an underwater glimpse of these famous predators. It's estimated that around 1 million people cage dive with white sharks between 1991 and 2016 in South Africa, with a peak of 85,000 in 2016 alone. This cage diving ecotourism brought in millions of dollars of revenue to the country's economy every year, and scientists have placed a conservation value for the Western Cape population of white sharks at an astonishing $240 million in the last 30 years. But these locations weren't just tourism hotspots, they were scientific gold mines. Researchers came from around the world to study hunting behavior, migration patterns, population structure, because nowhere else offered such consistent and predictable sightings of adult great white sharks. At Seal Island, scientists first documented one of the most famous hunting strategies in the animal kingdom: breaching. Massive white sharks launching themselves out of the water at seals, a behavior that became iconic, almost mythical. But other more subtle behavioral research was being conducted at the same time too, like cognition, social hierarchies, and dominance, like in this wild experiment with scientist Dr. Mark Marks. Mark and I are in conversation at the moment, so if you want to find out more about this behavioral research that he was working on back in the 90s, then make sure you let me know in the comments. Honestly, it was wild. Anyway, the white sharks in South Africa weren't just present, they were dominant, stable, or at least that's what it looked like, because even during those peak years, subtle changes were already beginning. And then, almost suddenly, they were gone. By the mid-2010s, or specifically for certain regions, 2017, sightings in places like Mossel Bay and Gansbaai began to drop sharply. Cage diving operators noticed first, then researchers, and then the rest of the world. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and months into years, and the sharks never really came back, bar the odd sporadic sighting. Boats returned to shore with disappointed tourists, with nothing on the cameras except open blue water, and humans being humans, we looked for a dramatic explanation. From 2017 onwards, some something strange started cropping up on beaches in the region. Several white shark carcasses washed ashore, their livers surgically removed with the precision that you'd expect from a highly qualified doctor. The culprits? Killer whales. Specifically a pair that would soon become famous around the world, port and starboard. Now, this discovery was pretty shocking to everyone, really. Not because killer whales killing white sharks was unheard of, that happened in other parts of the world, but because of how rarely it was observed, and on this occasion, how clearly it was being documented. It was most noticeably documented in Dr. Alison Towner's 2022 research paper, where aerial footage from a helicopter and a drone revealed the killer whale predation procedure. This footage spread around the world like wildfire, and as of currently, the original video uploaded to YouTube has a whopping 7.5 million views. I imagine because it was the clearest, most direct observation we had at the time of killer whales doing this to white sharks. A few years prior to Alison's research paper though, back in 2017, the washed up white shark carcasses were headline news, and soon after, the white shark sightings plummeted even further. I think looking at it broadly, the narrative here seems pretty obvious. Killer whales arrive, sharks flee. Simple, clean, compelling. And as time went on, some scientists explored the narrative a little bit further by suggesting that the white sharks in South Africa hadn't disappeared, they'd just moved somewhere else. Dr. Heather Bowlby from the Canadian Atlantic Shark Research Lab in 2023 argued that the reported declines at the various aggregation sites in South Africa were likely the result of a population redistribution eastwards towards places like KwaZulu-Natal. And her team believed the primary driver here was from predation and related risk from orcas. Importantly though, also within that paper, they argued that the white shark population in South Africa has actually remained stable since they gained protections in 1991. That's a big one there because it would suggest there's barely been any population declines for these animals in over 30 years. A bold claim. But it's a claim that was also simultaneously being backed up by the South African government. Question marks starting to appear now, aren't they? Now, to be fair, the killer whale explanation wasn't wrong. White sharks do avoid killer whales. They respond to that predation risk by entirely abandoning areas after killer whale encounters, and this behavior has been documented in multiple locations around the world. So when orcas appeared along the South African coastline, the sharks disappeared very soon after, and then their sightings allegedly increased on the Eastern Cape. That connection there felt pretty undeniable. But we know by now that science isn't about what feels right. It's about patterns, timelines, and evidence. And when a team of researchers led by Dr. Enrico Gennari and Dr. Neil Hammerschlag started looking deeper, the timeline and the evidence didn't quite add up. This research here didn't start with orcas. It started by asking the question, were white sharks already in decline before the killer whales arrived? And to answer that, they analysed long-term data sets from historical aggregation sites across South Africa. They looked at shark sightings from tour operators, tagging data and fisheries records, but they also looked at environmental changes as well. And they found that declines didn't begin in 2017. They began earlier. Much earlier, years before killer whale and white shark predation became such a regular occurrence in South Africa. The disappearance of the sharks wasn't sudden like we've been led to believe by some of the research papers and the media stories. It was accelerating something that was already in motion. Now, to understand if you've got a declining population of a certain animal, you've first got to estimate what that population size is or was. And in the last 30 years, there's been a handful of attempts to estimate South Africa's white shark population size using a variety of techniques like conventional mark recapture analysis, where you catch a shark, tag it, and then see if you capture it again, to more innovative techniques like photo ID analysis or genetics. And each study that's been conducted has produced its own set of results. The first estimates from Cliff et al. 1996 placed the overall population size at the time of protection, i.e. 1991, at around 1,300 individuals. 17 years later, we had another study from Dr. Alison Towner that placed them at around 900 individuals. And then finally in 2016, Dr. Sarah Andriotti had two estimates, a photo ID study putting them at 438, and a genetics analysis that put them at an effective population size of 333. So those numbers right there, we've got 1,300 in the early 90s, 900 in the late 2000s, and somewhere between 300 and 400 in the early 2010s. That right there is showing us that this white shark population hasn't been increasing since their protections, or even remaining stable, but it's actually been decreasing for years before the apparent sudden disappearance of them all in 2017. And this is where the story starts to get a little bit uncomfortable. The killer whales were visible, dramatic, and easy to blame, but they're natural. It's a predator-prey dynamic that we see with loads of other species in the animal kingdom, and it's something you can't regulate or control in any way, shape, or form. But the other pressures facing white sharks in South Africa are quiet, almost invisible. Fishing nets, bycatch, prey depletion, habitat change, and each one of those there might not necessarily collapse an entire population, but combined together, you get a slow erosion of that population over time. White sharks mature late, they reproduce really slowly, and they can't quickly replace lost individuals into a population. So even when a small number are removed each year, intentionally or not, the effects of that compound over time. Looking at historical satellite tracking data for South African white sharks, it's clear the sharks spent more than 2/3 of their time within South Africa's exclusive economic zone, or the EEZ. And so when we're looking at anthropogenic threats to their survival, it's likely the ones that are happening within territorial waters that are the ones having the biggest impact. And if we're looking at South Africa specifically, there's two that stand out: the KwaZulu-Natal Lethal Shark Control Program, and then Bycatch within South Africa's Demersal Longline Fishery, both of which are regulated by the South African government. Over the last 40 years, the KwaZulu-Natal Control Program has, on average, captured and killed around 28 white sharks a year. Conservatively, you'd maybe put that number at around 20 every year. Now, that maybe doesn't sound like a lot, but that number far exceeds the amount of white sharks that you can remove from that population without seeing any evidence of declines. Looking at the Demersal Longline Fishery, though, that's where things start to get a bit fishy. There's a huge spatial overlap between these demersal fishing grounds and both juvenile and adult white sharks. The fishery itself targets small to medium-sized demersal sharks like smoothhounds, which are an important prey species for juvenile white sharks in South Africa. So you've got this double whammy here where the fishery is depleting the natural food source of young white sharks, but also at the same time potentially catching white sharks as bycatch. Now, having this big spatial overlap, you'd expect maybe for there to be some level of documented bycatch for white sharks here, right? But in over a 10-year period, the Demersal Longline Fishery reported just 2 incidental captures of white sharks to the South African Department of Fisheries and Environment. 2 in over 10 years. Those numbers make even less sense when you find out that South African government scientists actually did a 3-day trial experiment to assess the impact that this fishery might have on white sharks in the area. And in those 3 days, they caught 2 white sharks and killed another. So in 3 days in the same location, they caught 3 white sharks, but in over 10 years since that, they've only caught a further 2. Doesn't quite add up, does it? Either that population has decreased by so much that they just happen to not be incidentally capturing as many white sharks anymore, or the Demersal Longline Fishery is lying about their catches. Both eventualities aren't great, to be honest. We're talking about a fishery here that has been repeatedly reported and even convicted for fishing inside MPAs in the past, and has been known to report inaccurate catch rates to the government. And this shady fishing fleet is evidenced even more by a whistleblower who worked on Demersal Longline fishing vessel White Rose for 9 weeks back in 2011, called Oliver Godfrey. Just a quick heads up, you're about to see some pretty gruesome fisheries photos. Anyway, Oliver was hired by skipper Gary McFarlane, captain of the White Rose, based out of Port Elizabeth in South Africa, just east of Mossel Bay and Plettenberg Bay. Oliver, who was also a young photographer, jumped at the chance to join the crew and was ever present on 9 week-long fishing trips in 2011. It was claimed that Captain Gary McFarlane referred to himself as Shark Slayer, and based on the numbers of sharks they were catching, Oliver believes that he lived up to his name. Other than the tons of target sharks that were captured, Oliver showed that they were capturing non-permit species as well. Hundreds of grey nurse sharks, gully sharks, and hammerheads. Importantly here, across those 9 weeks, he claims that 3 great white sharks were entangled in the longlines and were killed while he was on board, and that he believed they were fishing next to and within marine protected areas. He documented what he could for as long as he could, but he said that he was so broken by the mass carnage and cruelty that it depressed him, so he left. After leaving the White Rose, he tried to get his story out there, but was advised by several people to just drop it. He'd got a bunch of photographs, and that was known amongst those who were working the vessels. According to Oliver, just after he left the job, his house was actually broken into, and the hard drive that contained most of the photos was stolen, although some of the photos had been saved to his iCloud account, of which you've just seen. All around there, that is a pretty crazy story, and if what Oliver says is true, it would be incredibly damning for the Demersal Longline Fishery and the South African government. Now, if we just do some quick maths here, by the South African government's own numbers, 3 white sharks in 3 days means that in 9 weeks, the longliners would have probably caught and killed more white sharks than Oliver remembers. So his numbers there aren't obscene, they're realistic. If we extrapolated it out, conservatively, it would work out at about 7 white sharks killed every year by every Demersal longline vessel that's operating in the area. So if we look at this as a whole, between the year 2000 and 2023, it's estimated the Demersal longline fishery could have been responsible for about 24 white shark deaths every year, and then the KwaZulu-Natal Shark Control Program was responsible for around 20 white shark deaths per year. That's a yearly average of 44 white sharks removed moved by those two anthropogenic pressures alone from a population of maybe around 500 to 1,000 individuals. That's about 5 to 10% of the total South African white shark population being removed every year for the last 2 decades. If that's not unsustainable, I don't know what is. And that's not even taking into account the unknown levels of natural predation from killer whales on the sharks. So yes, the killer whales matter here, but perhaps not in the way that the headlines might suggest. Rather than being the primary driver, they could instead perhaps be a trigger, a final pressure on a population that has already been pushed to its limits. Sure, these killer whales are contributing to white shark mortality, but they don't quite explain the lack of population increase since 1991, nor do they explain the declining trends in shark sightings, shark size, and genetic diversity across the entirety of South Africa. I did just mention this briefly, but we have to remember here that predation from killer whales is a natural phenomenon. It doesn't matter how high those levels of predation get, whatever the level, it doesn't fall under the management control of the South African government. On the flip side though, the ongoing mortality rates for white sharks in the Demersal Longline fishery and the KwaZulu-Natal Shark Control Programme does fall under government regulation. And at the estimated levels of mortality from those two things alone that we've just gone through, it's easily sufficient to stop white sharks from recovering here, and is probably actually contributing to their decline. If we're seeing these levels of decline in a place that was once considered to be the largest aggregation site for white sharks in the world in just a 15-year period, this is a huge problem. We could be talking about local ecological extinction of South African white sharks by 2060. It's bad. That killer whale narrative gave a more conforming story, a single explanation, a story with a beginning, middle, and end, but we know that's not how nature works. When you focus on the dramatic, you can sometimes miss the very slow crisis unfolding just beneath it. The most dangerous part of this story isn't the killer whales. South Africa's white sharks didn't disappear overnight. They faded over years, and it took us way too long to notice. According to this research paper though, all hope isn't lost. There's still a chance if the South African government acts quickly. Balancing public safety and community livelihoods here is obviously really important, but it can be done in more modern ways that don't involve a 70-year-old lethal shark control program. There's so many more non-lethal methods that can be used to protect swimmers and water users, like drone patrols, shark spotters, area-related deterrents, smart drum lines, the list could go on. I think in some kind of weird contradiction, there's the worry here that the First Nation to protect white sharks in the entire world could potentially also be the first nation to lose that very animal. What do you guys reckon? Have the fisheries and bycatch levels been to blame for all these years? How much of an impact do you think those killer whales are having? I want to hear all your thoughts in the comments below. Although, if you've enjoyed learning about white sharks with me today, then before you head off, I'd ask you to maybe check out this video here. In it, we look at how white shark migration is changing and how it's perhaps shifting further north in higher levels than we've ever seen before. So I'd really appreciate it if you give it a watch. Go on, I'll see you there.